Hey guys! Tonight we begin with one of those stories you've probably heard a million times, usually with drums, fireworks, and some guy in a powdered wig shouting about liberty. But don't worry, none of that here. This is your calm, late-night drift through one of history's loudest events, retold in the quietest way possible. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights. Maybe wrap yourself up like George III wrapped himself in delusions of control. Because tonight, we're heading back to the 18th century, where the tea was overpriced, the wigs were itchy, and the colonies were just a little too feisty for their own good. Now, before we dive into battles and Boston tea parties, let's zoom out. The American colonies weren't exactly America yet. They were more like a messy group chat where everyone has different vibes. You had New England, with its Puritan work ethic and suspiciously judgmental towns. You had the middle colonies, doing their whole trade and diversity thing. And then the southern colonies, who were basically aristocrats cosplaying as English country gentlemen, but with much hotter weather. Britain, meanwhile, looked at this situation like a parent who lent their kid the car for the weekend and is now realizing that the kid has moved to another state, started a family, and changed the Netflix password. It was complicated. But to really understand why this turned into revolution, and not just a grumpy letter exchange, you have to meet some of the characters. And trust me, they're worth staying awake for, even if only barely.
Let's start with King George III. Ah, yes, George. He was the guy who technically ruled over Britain and, by extension, these unruly colonies across the ocean. He wasn't supposed to be the cartoon villain Americans later made him out to be. He wasn't twirling a mustache, plotting to crush liberty. No, George was more like that well-meaning but clueless boss who writes too many memos and then gets confused when the interns quit. George was deeply into being king, like very into it, obsessed with details. He read reports, he worried about expenses, he tried to do the job properly. Which sounds nice until you realize he micromanaged everything. He was basically the type who would email you at 2 a.m. asking why you used a semicolon instead of a comma. Not a tyrant, just exhausting. And he had a problem. His colonies were expensive. They needed protection from the French, from Native American tribes, from pirates, from each other. And protection cost money. Money Britain didn't really have, because apparently fighting wars in Europe for decades on end had this annoying side effect called debt. So George and his ministers looked at the colonies and thought, maybe they should chip in. Seems reasonable, right? But here's the thing. Colonists did not see it that way. They were already paying local taxes. They were already running their little assemblies. They liked being left alone. Britain had this unofficial policy called salutary neglect, which basically meant London didn't care what the colonies were up to as long as trade kept flowing. It was like a parent saying, sure, just don't burn the house down. And the kids got used to it. So when Britain suddenly remembered the colonies existed and started sending tax collectors, it felt less like reasonable governance and more like an absentee landlord suddenly showing up and demanding back rent. Nobody likes that.
Let's float for a second over to the ministers in London, because they deserve their sleepy spotlight too. You had men like George Grenville, who was prime minister in the 1760s. Grenville was not a fun guy. His nickname might as well have been Spreadsheet McBoring. He thought taxes were just math problems to be solved. Stamp Act? Sure. Make them pay for their newspapers and legal documents. Simple. Except, of course, people hate paying for things they used to get for free. And then there was Charles Townshend. Now, he actually had some style. They called him Champagne Charlie because he liked a good drink and a witty remark. He slapped taxes on glass, paint, lead, paper, and tea. The everyday stuff colonists actually needed. It was like a cosmic joke. Let's tax everything useful, because why not double down? And then, hovering in the background, you had Lord North, who later becomes the guy in charge when everything really hits the fan. Lord North was loyal to the king, too loyal. He was the human equivalent of nodding along in every meeting and never saying, maybe this is a bad idea. Which, spoiler alert, it was. Meanwhile, across the ocean, colonial meters were sharpening their quills. Samuel Adams was stirring up trouble in Boston, basically inventing the concept of political spin. He could make a broken window sound like tyranny. His cousin, John Adams, the more uptight lawyer type, was writing long-winded arguments about rights and laws. And then there was Benjamin Franklin, who, let's be honest, was mostly in it for the networking and the parties. But we'll get to him later. The mood in the colonies turned sour quickly. Imagine you've been living in a house where the landlord never visits. You've redecorated, planted a garden, gotten comfortable. Then suddenly the landlord barges in and says, "New rules, rent's doubled. Also, I'll be staying in the guest room indefinitely." You'd be annoyed. That's basically how Americans felt when Parliament decided to legislate everything from thousands of miles away. The Stamp Act riots were the first sign this wasn't going to go smoothly. Colonists burned effigies of tax collectors, they ransacked houses, they got very creative with tar and feathers. Which, fun fact, wasn't just humiliating, it was also incredibly painful. But for our purposes, we'll just glide past the gore and say, not a great way to build mutual trust. Parliament eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but then, in a masterclass of bad timing, immediately passed the Declaratory Act, which basically said, fine, we'll take back this law you hate, but just so you know, we can make any law we want anytime, forever. Very chill, very calming, nothing ominous about that. The stage was set. Britain convinced it had the right to control the colonies. Colonists increasingly convinced Britain was just a distant bully with expensive tastes. And stuck between them, a vast ocean and a lot of mutual misunderstanding. Now, let's gently drift into one of the more famous tea-related meltdowns in history.
So let's float gently into one of the most over-dramatic food fights in history, the Boston Tea Party. If you've ever had a roommate who insisted on labeling their almond milk in the fridge, you'll understand how petty this whole thing was. Because at its core, the tea situation was just Britain trying to micromanage a pantry that wasn't technically theirs anymore. Here's the backstory. Tea was a big deal. Colonists loved it. They drank it morning, noon, and night. They drank it hot, they drank it cold, they pretended to be fancy while sipping it from chipped mugs. But all that tea came from Britain's East India Company, which was not exactly thriving. Imagine a mega corporation with a caffeine addiction and terrible financial planning. By the 1770s, the company was drowning in unsold tea and debt. So, Parliament, in its infinite wisdom, thought, let's bail them out by forcing Americans to drink only their tea. Cheap prices, legal monopoly, what could go wrong? Well, everything. Because Americans weren't mad about the price, they were mad about the principle, the no taxation without representation principle, to be precise. Which, yes, sounds like something you'd find printed on a tote bag in Williamsburg today, but back then, it was deadly serious. The colonists didn't want London deciding their shopping lists. They wanted their own say in the matter. And so, in December of 1773, a bunch of Bostonians, dressed up, badly, by the way, as Native Americans, climbed aboard East India Company ships and dumped the tea into the harbor. About 342 chests of the stuff, thousands of pounds worth, just bobbing in the salt water. Was this an act of high-minded resistance? Or was it a bunch of guys ruining everyone's breakfast beverage supply? Probably both. Either way, the protest was oddly polite. They broke open the crates, dumped the tea, and then swept the decks clean afterward, because nothing says revolution like tidying up. Back in London, the reaction was not amused.
Parliament basically said, "You want to play games? Fine, we'll show you consequences." And thus came the Coercive Acts, which the colonists immediately rebranded as the Intolerable Acts, because of course they did. These laws shut down Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, limited town meetings, allowed royal officials to be tried back in Britain, and basically placed Massachusetts under curfew. It was the 18th century version of being grounded forever.
Other colonies, who usually didn't care much about Boston, suddenly started paying attention. It was like watching your annoying cousin finally get punished and realizing, oh no, this might happen to me next. Solidarity spread. Let's drift now to some of the personalities stirring in the mix. There was Samuel Adams again, Boston's favorite troublemaker. He was basically a professional agitator at this point. If Twitter had existed in 1773, he would have been trending daily. He wrote pamphlets, gave speeches, and exaggerated British villainy with a flair that would make modern tabloids blush. Then you had John Hancock, yes, the signature guy. He was rich, flashy, and very good at making rebellion look stylish. His fortune came partly from smuggling, so naturally he wasn't thrilled about Britain tightening trade laws. His big, bold signature on the Declaration of Independence later was less about patriotism and more about brand consistency. Over in Virginia, you had Patrick Henry, delivering his "Give me liberty or give me death" line with all the dramatic flair of a community theater actor who never gets cast as Hamlet. People ate it up. And let's not forget George Washington. At this point, he was still more farmer than general. A tall, reserved man with dental issues and a love of land speculation. He wasn't the fiery speech-giver type, more like the strong, silent type who nods gravely in the corner while everyone else argues. Which, as it turns out, is exactly what you want in a revolutionary figurehead. So, with tempers rising, the colonies decided they needed a meeting. Enter the First Continental Congress in 1774. It was basically a very awkward family reunion where nobody liked each other much, but everyone agreed they hated Britain more. Delegates gathered in Philadelphia, wearing their finest wigs and pretending to be unified. In reality, New England wanted full confrontation. The middle colonies wanted compromise, and the South just wanted to protect its own interests while looking dignified. Still, they managed to draft petitions, boycott British goods, and agreed to meet again if things got worse. Spoiler, things got worse. Back in London, George III read the petitions and basically shrugged. He thought the colonists were just being whiny teenagers. In his mind, he wasn't depressing anyone. He was just asking them to pay their fair share. He genuinely couldn't grasp why this was escalating. Which, honestly, is part of what makes this whole story so inevitable. Because here's the truth. The American Revolution wasn't really about taxes. It was about control. The colonists had gotten a taste of running their own affairs during decades of neglect, and they weren't giving that up. Britain wanted obedience. The colonists wanted autonomy. And neither side was very good at compromise. By early 1775, the situation was boiling. In Massachusetts, militias were drilling. In Britain, troops were being sent over. Both sides were basically daring the other to blink first. And then, Lexington and Concord happened. But let's not rush there yet. We'll get to the musket fire in a moment. For now, let's linger on the absurdity of men in wigs arguing over tea, taxes, and representation, because it's strangely comforting to realize that even the most world-changing revolutions start with paperwork and beverages. So take another sip of your own tea, or coffee, or whatever keeps you awake at this hour, and let's drift slowly toward the first shots fired, the first casualties, and the beginning of a war that nobody really thought would last as long as it did.
All right. We've had our tea, we've had our petitions, we've even had Congress trying its best to look serious while half the delegates secretly wondered when the tavern opened. Now it's 1775, and things are about to get loud. Though we'll keep our narration very, very quiet. Picture Massachusetts in the spring. Farmers are tending fields, children are helping with chores, and militias, ordinary men with muskets, are gathering on village greens, drilling in case the redcoats come stomping around. They called themselves Minutemen, because supposedly they could be ready in a minute. Which sounds impressive until you remember a minute was actually a lot of time in the 18th century. No phones to check, no microwaves to beep. Just grab your musket, kiss the cow goodbye, and off you go. Meanwhile, in Boston, General Thomas Gage was in charge of the British garrison. He had a problem. Parliament had told him to crack down on rebellion. But Massachusetts was practically buzzing with militias and smuggled gunpowder. Gage knew that sitting around wouldn't solve anything, so he planned a little field trip. Send troops to Concord, seize the colonial supplies, remind everyone who's boss. Quick, clean, efficient. Except nothing about the British Army in 1775 was quick, clean, or efficient. The redcoats marched in perfect lines, wearing bright scarlet coats that might as well have been giant "shoot me" signs. They carried heavy packs, moved slowly, and attracted a lot of attention. News of their march spread almost instantly thanks to a network of riders. And yes, this is where Paul Revere comes clopping in. He wasn't the only rider. There were several others, but Revere got the best PR afterward. He galloped through the countryside shouting warnings, which is very dramatic in poems, but probably less dramatic in reality. More like, "Hey guys, soldiers are coming, maybe hide your stuff." Still, it worked. The alarm spread. Minutemen grabbed their muskets. At dawn on April 19, 1775, the British reached Lexington. A small group of militia stood waiting. Nobody wanted to start shooting. The colonial militia were nervous. The British officers were confused. Someone fired a shot. To this day, nobody knows who. And suddenly, muskets cracked, smoke filled the air, and a handful of men lay dead. The shot heard round the world, as Ralph Waldo Emerson later called it, though at the time it was probably just called a mess. The British pushed on to Concord, found the supplies mostly gone, and then things really unraveled. Because now the militias were swarming. Farmers, shopkeepers, random guys with muskets hiding behind stone walls and trees. This wasn't orderly European warfare. This was guerrilla-style harassment, and the redcoats hated it. On their long march back to Boston, the soldiers were picked off from all sides. By the end of the day, nearly 300 British were dead, wounded, or missing. The colonists lost fewer than 100. It wasn't exactly a decisive battle, but it felt like one. Colonists had stood up to the mighty British Army and survived, which was both inspiring and terrifying, because now there was no going back.
King George, across the ocean, heard about the fighting and declared the colonies in open rebellion, which was very official, very dramatic, and essentially a way of saying, "Okay, fine, now it's war." The colonists, meanwhile, scrambled to organize. Militias became an army, sort of. They were ragtag, underfunded, and more interested in going home for harvest than in long campaigns. But they had enthusiasm. They also had George Washington, who was unanimously chosen to lead them at the Second Continental Congress. Why Washington? Well, partly because he was tall and wore a uniform and looked serious. In politics, appearances matter. Plus, he was from Virginia, and Congress wanted to show this wasn't just a New England tantrum. By choosing a Southerner, they made it a united front. Smart move. Washington accepted with grim humility, which again was his thing. He wasn't a brilliant strategist, but he was steady, dignified, and stubborn. Perfect qualities for leading a barely functioning army against the world's most powerful empire. Back in Boston, the first real siege was already underway. Colonial forces surrounded the city, trapping the British inside.
which led to the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775. Now, the funny thing is, most of the fighting wasn't on Bunker Hill at all, but on nearby Breed's Hill. Details. The colonists built fortifications. The British, in their infinite commitment to red-coated pageantry, decided to march straight up the hill in neat lines. Twice, the colonists shot them down. The third time, the colonists ran out of ammunition and had to retreat. Technically, the British won, but it was such a bloody victory, over 1,000 casualties, that it felt hollow. Colonists gained confidence. If they could inflict that kind of damage while barely trained, maybe this wasn't hopeless after all. And so, by midsummer, the sleepy skirmishes had become a full-blown revolution. Not officially declared yet, that will come in 1776. But the colonies in Britain were locked in a fight that would drag on far longer than anyone imagined. Still, for now, let's linger in 1775. The air smells of gunpowder, the wigs are still powdered, and both sides are settling in for what they think might be a quick conflict. Spoiler, it wasn't. Let's gently drift next into 1776, where independence starts appearing on the horizon.
So we've reached 1776, which, in American history, is basically the Beyoncé year, the one everyone remembers, quotes, and prints on t-shirts. But like most famous years, the reality was a little messier, a little slower, and a lot less glamorous than the fireworks make it seem. Picture the colonies in January. Snowy, tense, and not at all unified. Militias were still camped around Boston, trying to keep the British bottled up inside. Washington was learning that commanding farmers with muskets was a bit like herding cats. Patriotic cats, sure, but still cats. Some men left after a few weeks, others argued about pay. Supplies were scarce, ammunition was short, and Washington, in his dignified silence, was probably wondering why he ever agreed to this job. Meanwhile, the idea of independence wasn't obvious to everyone. Plenty of colonists still considered themselves loyal to Britain. They didn't love Parliament's taxes, but breaking away entirely, that felt extreme. For months, the big debate was, do we really want divorce or just counseling? And then along came a pamphlet. Enter Thomas Paine, an Englishman with a gift for writing and a knack for offending people. In January 1776, he published Common Sense. It was short, sharp, and very, very clear. No flowery speeches, no Latin quotations, just plain arguments for independence. Britain is an island, he said. America is a continent. Why should a little island rule a continent? Kings are ridiculous. Monarchy is outdated. It's time to cut the cord. The pamphlet spread like wildfire. Colonists read it in taverns, discussed it in town squares, and passed it around like 18th century clickbait. For many, it was the first time independence seemed not just possible, but necessary. Paine's tone was blunt, even rude, which is probably why it worked. People love a little snark. By spring, Congress was warming to the idea, especially after Britain made it clear they weren't interested in compromise. King George III issued his proclamation of rebellion, basically declaring every colonist a traitor, which, fun fact, is not the best way to win hearts and minds. So, in June, the Continental Congress formed a committee to draft the Declaration. 5 men were chosen: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and, of course, Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson was young, awkward, and not especially charismatic, but he could write. He spent days in a rented room in Philadelphia scratching away with a quill, drafting phrases that would echo for centuries. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lofty words, though let's be honest, he didn't exactly practice what he preached on equality. Hypocrisy was practically a colonial pastime.
Franklin and Adams edited the draft. Congress debated, deleted, and polished. And finally, on July 2nd, 1776, they voted for independence. That's right, the actual decision happened on July 2,
but the final wording and adoption came on July 4, which is why Americans now eat hot dogs and watch fireworks on the 4th instead of the 2nd. A small twist of history, immortalized in barbecue. When the Declaration was read aloud in public, bells rang, crowds cheered, and copies spread across the colonies. In New York, they even pulled down a statue of King George and melted it into musket balls. Symbolism with practical benefits. Back in London, George III was not impressed. To him, this was just paperwork from some ungrateful subjects. He believed the rebellion could still be crushed with enough force. After all, Britain had the world's strongest navy, professional soldiers, and resources. The colonies had enthusiasm, but enthusiasm doesn't win wars, at least not usually. And indeed, 1776 was a rough year for Washington's army. After forcing the British out of Boston in March, Washington moved his men to New York, expecting the next attack. And oh, did it come. General William Howe brought a massive British force to New York Harbor. Soldiers, ships, Hessian mercenaries from Germany. It was overwhelming. Washington's inexperienced army was no match. They were routed at the Battle of Long Island in August. Thousands fled, hundreds were captured, and the British occupied New York City. For months, Washington's army retreated across New Jersey, cold, hungry, and discouraged. Soldiers deserted, morale plummeted. By December, the revolution looked shaky. The Declaration had been signed, yes, but paper declarations don't stop bayonets. And then, in a last-ditch effort, Washington pulled off something bold, by his standards anyway. On Christmas night 1776, he led his men across the icy Delaware River and surprised a Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory was small but sweet. A handful of prisoners, a boost to morale, and a reminder that the cause wasn't dead yet. So, 1776 ended not with a grand triumph, but with a tiny spark of hope. A fragile new nation declared, battered in battle, clinging to survival. As the snow settled and the soldiers shivered, nobody knew how long the war would drag on. But for now, the colonies had made their choice. The breakup with Britain was official, and like most breakups, things were about to get messy. Let's float into 1777 next, where the war staggers, stumbles, and occasionally surprises everyone.
So, the colonies had declared independence, which sounds very bold on parchment, but in reality, it was like announcing you've quit your job before finding out whether anyone else will actually hire you. The paperwork looked nice, but the British weren't impressed, and the war rolled on. Let's start with 1777. Britain had a plan, which is always suspicious in this period because British plans often fell apart somewhere between London and the New World. The grand idea was simple. Cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, because obviously the problem was Boston and its tea-throwing rebels. If you could isolate New England, the thinking went, the rest of the colonies would calm down, sip their rum, and maybe come back to the empire. To achieve this, General John Burgoyne, known affectionately and not always kindly as Gentleman Johnny, marched down from Canada with a large British force. The plan was for Burgoyne to meet up with General Howe coming north from New York City, and together they would squeeze the rebellion like an 18th century panini press. Except, small detail, Howe never got the memo. Instead of marching north, he decided to capture Philadelphia because why not take the rebel capital for the vibes? Washington tried to stop him, fought bravely at Brandywine, and lost. The British strolled into Philadelphia in September 1777. Congress fled the city, probably very relieved to find excuses for not paying tavern tabs. So Howe got his prize, but Burgoyne? Poor Gentleman Johnny was left stranded upstate New York with dwindling supplies, hostile countryside, and way too much luggage. He had insisted on bringing fine wine, fancy uniforms, and even his mistress on the campaign. Because nothing says military efficiency like stopping for champagne breaks in the wilderness. By October, Burgoyne's force was surrounded at Saratoga. 2 battles later, he surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men. A disaster for Britain,
a miracle for the Americans. Why was Saratoga such a big deal? Because it finally convinced France that maybe, just maybe, these rebels weren't going to collapse after all. The French, who hated Britain more than they loved America, had been secretly sending supplies and weapons. But now, after Saratoga, they went public. In early 1778, France formally allied with the United States. Suddenly, this scrappy rebellion became an international war. Washington, meanwhile, wasn't exactly celebrating. While diplomacy danced in Paris, he and his army were huddled at Valley Forge for the winter of 1777-1778. And if you've ever wanted to picture patriotism in its most miserable form, Valley Forge is the place.
Imagine thousands of soldiers in threadbare clothes, snow on the ground, no shoes, no food, disease spreading through the camp, men gnawing on boiled leather because there was nothing else to eat, Washington himself pacing in the snow, trying to look confident, while probably wondering how many soldiers would survive until spring. It was bleak. But oddly, Valley Forge was also transformative. Enter Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer who spoke little English but had a lot of experience shouting at soldiers. He drilled the Continental Army with a mix of broken language, dramatic hand gestures, and pure persistence. Slowly, painfully, the army learned discipline. Muskets were cleaned properly. Marches were coordinated. Men actually stood in straight lines. Revolutionary stuff, literally. So by the time spring arrived, Washington's army wasn't just a mob of farmers anymore. They were still ragtag, still underfed, but now they could actually fight like soldiers, which was going to be important because Britain wasn't backing down. Across the Atlantic, King George and Parliament were fuming. The rebellion had dragged on longer than anyone expected, costlier too. And now France had joined in, which meant Britain had to worry about their global empire, Caribbean sugar islands, India, naval battles everywhere. The American colonies, once seen as an annoying sideshow, were now part of a much bigger mess. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, just picture it, 1778. Britain licking its wounds from Saratoga, France officially sending ships, soldiers, and money. Washington's men staggering out of Valley Forge, slightly less likely to run away from battle. The revolution had survived its darkest winter. And it was about to get even stranger, with alliances, betrayals, and more generals trying and failing to be famous. So let's drift next into the middle years of the war, where Benedict Arnold decides to audition for the role of most famous traitor, and France finally shows up with actual ships,